All right, so in case you did not see this presentation, or my presentation this morning, my name is Krajewski. I'm the Vice President of Product Management for HMI's Data Business Unit. This morning I talked a bit about what is Aviva Operations Control, and I introduced this next slide a little bit, and I'm going to spend a bit of time going over a bunch of these themes in a bit more detail to give you an understanding of kind of how we see the market shaping up and how some of these technologies we expect to affect things. You'll see a continuation of the theme intentionally as part of this, but I'll walk through these in a bit of time. I think we have a full hour for this session here, so I'll make sure I close this one on time to keep us on topic here and on schedule. So I'll start over here on the customer trends. Things appear in the customer trends based upon me having conversations with customers and them being unrepeated. Just because you may have a trend that doesn't appear doesn't mean we don't believe in it, we don't know it, or are aware of it. These are tend to be things that we hear with some amount of repetition, right? So, example, organizational convergence. What's that about? Organizational convergence. Very often, if I look at classically, who are the people with the buy decision with respect to the HMI's data products? Traditionally, those have been the same people selecting PLCs, selecting the other operational technologies or OT in the organization. With increasing rapidity, what we see here is a number of times that OT is now reporting into IT, and IT starts to place its own strategies, its own processes, it starts to influence it. Typically, it starts with an organizational change, right? The head of OT now reports into someone in IT. Then you'll start seeing some processes change. This is usually where you start finding fun things like, calls into support of, your software just stopped running. We didn't do anything, it just stopped. And then after you dig a little bit, you find out that someone in IT decided that, well, that account does not need that privilege. They removed a privilege from an account, or they changed settings for ports and said, we're going to block certain ports, or we're going to disable decom. This is typically where IT practices start to find their way into OT. But eventually what tends to happen as organizations move through this kind of maturing, if you will, is that IT starts creating strategies. And strategies that end up affecting the technology decisions and the selections that are happening on the OT space. So we see all different flavors. I will tell you, I still see plenty of people where the OT department operates independently. That's not uncommon, that's not rare, and it is classically where we've been. But I've started to see this kind of shift in the way that organizations are working consistently enough that it made my list, right? Software sprawl, I talked a bit about that this morning, where software sprawl is really that element of where customers are investing in a number of solutions and increasingly asking themselves, how do I get more value out of the software I want, right? I mentioned a number of times today that I see customers that have anywhere between 30 and 40 software applications that are around their operation. And so what we'll find here is increasingly they're asking, could we do different? Could we operate different? Could we do other things? Sometimes what you'll find out is that customers start to look at things like, can I start offering digital services? Can I start selling services? We've seen cases where customers start, changing their own business models, whereas they used to be focused on selling a product, but now they're actually going to have a digital service associated with the traditional products and other services that they offer. So those are other kind of trends that we see. Resource challenges, this is a consistent one that's been here for years, but I don't see it going anywhere, is that I remember there was some organizations when I would meet with their corporate engineering teams, and their corporate engineering teams would be staffed with 20, 30 people, and I meet with them years later, 4, 5 guys in a room, they're like, yeah, what are you guys doing? We're still doing it all, right? And what tends to happen in those kinds of cases, very commonly, is that they're so busy fighting fires that when you ask them more information, like, so where do you guys see yourselves in 3 years? Well, I hope to have upgraded that system, and I hope to move these guys onto XP or something silly like that. And you'll find out that they end up fighting fires, which gives them less and less time to focus on strategic outcomes within their organization. Informational silos breakdown. This kind of comes a companion with the software sprawl, where this notion of, okay, we've got a lot of this software out here, we want to start getting more value out of it, and how do we start breaking down those silos? How do I get us to utilize that data more consistently? This is something that we have recognized early on and drove us to a lot of investments around LMI. You'll see the things that we're doing, whether it's unified namespaces and other types of architectures, which align to this intention. Globalization and consolidation. You know, I will still say that we still find customers that have some small local operations, but I will say that for many of those, I probably have also another large group of customers which have grown through mergers and acquisitions. So they've acquired other technologies, and so that they will say, hey, look, I've got one of everything under the sun. I've got one of every PLC ever made. I've got one of every HMI data that's ever been put on the marketplace. And so these mergers and acquisitions start to grow not only those technology choices that they made by intention, but some which were made via mergers, acquisitions. Sometimes they're selling off businesses in cases, and this is not uncommon, especially in the oil and gas space, where they will sell off a pipeline or a section of pipeline, and then they have to go and re-implement this data solution because they don't own the one that was there before. A lot of kind of interesting things have happened along those lines. Digital transformation and data priority. This is kind of, again, a continuation of the theme. I'll say that the data priority element comes to where increasingly we can look at some definitions that are used out there for the term digital transformation. Those definitions often include things where you're making data a top priority in your business, where it's still important that your mission critical services are still being delivered, but increasingly that data is how they're making decisions. It's how they're going to improve their products. It's how they're going to improve their business. It's how they're going to get that next layer of margin out of their business. And so it becomes increasingly important. Again, I'm not suggesting these are the only things, but these are ones that are certainly we're hearing with a significant amount of repetition. I'm going to move on to the technology space, which in this case, I think these are somewhat speak for themselves, because I think for a lot of us that kind of live in this technology world, you're not just hearing me talk about this, you're going to hear a lot of organizations talk about the impact of hybrid cloud. Now, for those of you who probably maybe don't live in a world where hybrid cloud is important to you, one of the things that we have to do as an organization that builds products is that we have to look on the platforms that we build upon. Where are their investment plans? Where are they going? So I'll give you an example. So when I first started this organization, we were building on Windows, even client operating systems, because server operating systems didn't exist. So as Microsoft started to go beyond the Windows for work groups and started investing in Windows NT, which became Windows 2000 Server, which became on and on with a variety of those server-based technologies, we followed that investment path. Okay, so as Microsoft was investing in things like networking and Active Directory, we followed that investment to ensure that we integrated with them. So if you look at people like Microsoft, it's been a long-term traditional partner of ours and will continue to be a partner of ours for a long, long time. Where are they spending their money? Are they putting all their money in the Windows basket? What do you think? How much of Microsoft's investment is going towards Azure versus how much of it is going towards Windows? And we have to look at that and understand what it's likely going to be the implications on our business. Right? How quickly are they going to be moving it? So this hybrid cloud space is becoming important to us and more every day. Containers and Kubernetes. I'll tell you that for those of you that these are words that are in your vocabulary, I'll be the first to admit that maybe as recent as a year ago, they weren't things that I was very, very comfortable with. I bet many of you are comfortable with things like virtualization, virtual machines. We don't tend to install on metal, as we used to say. We install on direct operating system, but you install indirectly. And what that has often allowed customers to do is they're able to make better utilization of their resources. So they have computers. And so they install, if they have computers, a lot of times we find that on average, the computers were only using 15% of the resources, right? So very often, if you only have installed on metal, most of that computer's RAM and CPU is sitting there doing nothing. So virtualization allowed them to get more value out of their hardware investment, right? So they were able to run multiple servers on a single piece of hardware and utilize more of those resources as opposed to letting them sit still. We're going to agree with that? So with containers, you can take that go to the next level. Because how much of that resources are actually going to running Windows, right? So when you run a Windows terminal, a remote desktop, or a virtual server, then you're running a lot of overhead, which is RAM consumed in operating Windows infrastructure. You know, there's CPU utilized to run Windows infrastructure. Also running things like multiple instances of endpoint protection software, which is sitting there, not necessarily deriving direct value to the organization. And so when you look at containers, it's another way of skinning down, right? It's a way of being able to say less overhead, so I can run this. It's not just virtualizing the operating system and the application, but it goes to virtualizing the application. So more and more of the compute resources that I'm investing in are going directly towards the things that are of value to me and not overhead, if you will. right? Other things that containers bring to bear are that in order to restore, if you have to restore a VM, average VM size like 30 gigs for a virtual machine. So if you have to restore a container, they're very lightweight, very small. So the time to restore a container can be very short. The time to stand up things like redundancy. And in this case, is when you look at Kubernetes, it also kind of goes hand in hand with another term that I don't have listed up there, which would be things like microservice architectures. Many of you had gone through the tour, and they showed off things like the patents. And I actually have 3 patents up there that are related to how we did redundancy in application server. I spent a while as an architect in an R&D organization. And I realized recently they're useless. Because in the future, redundancy is not going to be done at the software layer, it's done at the infrastructure layer. And now this may be more in the nerd zone, and for those of you who this makes little sense to, you don't have to worry about it, but I will tell you that where you used to have to take the state of a piece of software and move it to a secondary location. Now what happens is people are building what's called stateless software, where the state sits in the operating system or in the infrastructure, such that if this service fails, you start it up somewhere else and the infrastructure provides its state. What that means is that things like the redundancy message channel that you use in system platforms to be able to synchronize the alarms, the history, the current values, and those things, those retentive data, those just reside as part of the infrastructure. It's a new version of an operating system function. So that currently, like things like disaster recovery and redundancy and fault tolerance are not coded in. They're part of the application architecture, right? It's a different way of approaching these types of things. Managed services and software as a service starts taking that and goes, well, to what extent can we offload this off of the customer's environment as well? It's interesting because I had a conversation the other day, not too long ago, which really kind of surprised me. It was a conversation with a food supplier, and this food supplier had identified that we were kind of the last servers on premise. They had virtually moved everything else, all the IT stuff. This is the case where the IT organization had taken responsibility for all computing at this organization a number of years back, and they had systematically moved everything off premise, right? They started with the things which are more in the office space, file servers, email servers, those kinds of things. Eventually, they started moving things up there. So your CMMS applications, your finances, those things start moving to the cloud. And eventually, they get down to the point where, hey, there's only one box of blinking lights. What's that mean? That's our SCADA system. And they start asking, can we move that? And in some customers, what they've done is that because those other IT applications have been so mission critical, they've got those with such amount of reliability, they are now starting to be willing to move the SCADA systems to the cloud as well. Very often this starts with what I call a lift and shift. Well, they'll say, hey, can you support AWS? Can you support a virtual machine in AWS, which we're in the process of fully supporting? But then eventually they want to go to, well, when you move a virtual machine, someone still has to patch that operating system. Someone still has to manage that software. Someone still has to perform updates on that. And so you have removed the hardware responsibility in the investment, moved that off premise, but you still have an overall overhead associated with that. And so when you start moving to managed services, then the vendor becomes the person responsible for it. I imagine many of us here have subscriptions to things like Spotify or Netflix, all running as managed services in the cloud. When Spotify wants to upgrade, you don't do that. You have to upgrade your app, but that really is not the actual software. That's the endpoint that accesses the service and the background. But you never have to upgrade when they add new movies or add new artists or add new features to give you DJs access to different playlists. Those are things that are done on the back end. And we've been working heavily in that direction here at Aviva so that we can actually update with new features every 2 weeks on our cloud things. Our things that are on premise take us typically somewhere between 12 to 18 or 24 months to upgrade. And it was interesting, a couple years back, we moved to a 6-month software cadence. We did this with version 2017. We had version 2017, and then 6 months later, we had 2017 update 1. And then 6 months after that, we had 2017 update 2. And 6 months after that, we had 2017 update 3. Everyone hated it. Everyone hated that speed. Our technical teams couldn't keep up with the speed. Our support organizations couldn't keep up with the speed. Our distributors weren't able to communicate the value because it was just the rhythm of the organization didn't work on that cycle. In the future, I believe it will. In the future, we have to be able to move much more agile, and this is a way that we'll get there. Now, do I see that happening tomorrow? Frankly, no. Especially given today, for those of you who have noticed, we had a difficult time this morning with a lot of our cloud services because Azure had a
I think it was a worldwide outage of their front end. Which basically meant all the web servers running in there for web pages, you couldn't access them. And so luckily, a lot of our systems were just directly accessing the back-end services, and we're able to keep up with a lot of the demos. So it certainly is one of those things you have to keep an eye on. When are these things going to be ready for mission critical? But it is certainly what we're starting with is we start with non-mission critical things, moving those to managed services. And you've already seen a lot of that in our
roadmap and in our activities. So generative AI, I imagine many of us have used this. Very often I can't find anybody who hasn't started to tinker with it in some way, shape, or form. Asking questions, helping prepare documents, helping to create content. And Rashesh alluded to a bit of this, is that we're actually starting to do a lot of proof of concepts ourselves, is that how we can do things. I remember, anybody here ever heard of Sora? It's an AI used for video creation. And so Sora, I would say it was about 2 years ago only when they were trying to create a video. It was a video of Will Smith, the actor, eating spaghetti. And while it actually created something, it looked terrible. His head was long, it looked sort of alien. And a year later, they were able to create clean images, or clean video of this. Just the other day, my son walks up to me and he shows me a video clip that he made where he took our dog and morphed him into a mean, angry thing that attacked you through the screen. And he was like, oh yeah, I said, what'd you use to do that? Because it's this sort of thing. So now it's gotten to the point where my teenage son is able to create video just by giving it a prompt. Now, in this space, how long will it be before we are able to do things like create user interfaces by using prompts? Because what we find here, and as a guy who used to be a system integrator, I know that a lot of times the sales guys will come in and ask me, they think, all right, I need to give this customer a quote on how much this is going to take. Can you give me an idea of how much it would take for us as an engineering to build out this HMI screen? And typically, the easy, lazy way was count the sheets of piping and instrumentation, and that's how many days of engineering it would take to build the associated HMI displays. Imagine if you could take that down to maybe it's an hour instead of a day. Maybe you could do many of them, and maybe you can really collapse that. Could you collapse that 80, 90%? So it's a sincere, interesting way. Certainly things like generative AI is already very, very used today in terms of coding, right? If you wanted to, you could actually go today onto any one of them and say, hey, provide me a script for use of the system platform that can make a connection to a database, right? It'll do that for you. It'll create the right syntax that's necessary for our applications. This is something that continues to get improved in areas that we believe that we can offer value. Agentic AI, large language models, model context protocol. This starts getting to the point where, first let's talk about large language models. Those are the things that ChatGPT, where you can basically give it a natural language input, right? Give it some text, and it'll provide you a response to that. But it requires you to actually go and enter text. Well, what agents can do is you can think of agents as being able to enter that text on your behalf. Right? A simple thing could be, hey, could you do a daily check on a friend of mine who's looking to buy a home? So we created a little agent that actually went into the local real estate market and said, every day, could you look for new listings that are of this type, this many square feet, this price range? And so he just had this agent that did that. So instead of him typing that thing into an LLM every day, he let the agent just send him a report on a daily basis around what was different. And so MCP is the thing that allows us to be able to have agents that can run against our software, or our APIs, or our application programming interfaces. And so that gives us an opportunity. Oh, go away, Omar. Sorry. That's going. I guess I should have logged out of that before I jumped on this. So that's an example of things that you can do in those areas. Industry 4.0, fourth industrial revolution in UNS. Those all kind of fall into a similar category. What we found there is, I remember the first time I heard fourth industrial revolution, I kind of giggled because I didn't think it was really a viable thing. It basically said, at some point, everything's going to be able to talk to everything else. And I said, yeah, based on what standard? We all got one, and applying with those things is hard, right? So how are we going to ensure that interoperability? But this notion of Industry 4.0 solutions was to, or Industry 4.0, was to collapse that stack. Traditionally, what we do inside, especially in this industry, is that we've had the traditional Purdue reference model. Purdue reference model starts with the devices, connecting into controllers, connecting into HMI SCADA layer, connecting into NES layers, connecting to ERP layers. But the notion there is that what if the controllers could speak to the ERPs, or you didn't have to have all that intermediate steps. That was kind of the vision of anything could talk to anything. Well, these UNS architectures, like the ones I was describing in the tours I was doing above, make some of that more viable, make it an option. Where in the past it was more of a pipe dream, now it is a reality. And I would say that it's one that's aggressively moving both in Europe as well as North America. So we're seeing that happen. MQTT brokers, I would say that there's two styles of MQTT broker deployments. One that I say would happen below this data, helping us ingest data from the field, right? If you've got a bunch of data in the field, I know one example was a guy in water had a bunch of lift stations. Traditionally, he was using radios to be able to get information into his system. And he eliminated them and started using a public network instead and had it published through an MQTT to a broker that he was hosting in Amazon, and then utilizing our drivers to pull the information off of Amazon into his control room. That is an example of being able to pull that data from the field, or what I like to say, below the SCADA layer. Above the SCADA layers, we're starting to see MQTT as a distributed way of a mechanism for distributing information around an enterprise. It doesn't mean there's only one instance of an MQTT broker. Very often, much like you'll see us do tiered historians, like I have a bunch of tier 1 historians, and I have a tier 2 historian which replicates. That's also a very common architecture you'll see in MQTT brokers, where I'll have a site level broker running an on-premise, and then I may have a cloud broker, which I choose to either replicate everything or some element of that up to that centralized broker for distribution around an organization. So many different ways you see that happening. Data operations. Data operations is kind of the space that I describe it here, is where when you speak to all those different pieces of software, they all have different ways they present the data. Right? It would be nice if they all presented it in the same kind of model. I like to use a simple example of, hey, if I've got an OPC server over here and an MQTT server over there, what are the chances their models align? That they both use an enterprise site, area line, cell, ISA 95 type structure? Chances are no. But if you go beyond that and you start looking at ERP systems and other things that certainly are not going to adhere to the same models, the DataOps is an area where you're starting to see not more of it's also kind of considered like this larger general space of data operations, but you're starting to see packages and different solutions which are specifically targeted at data comes in, I transform it, I normalize it, I may cleanse it to test it for quality and things like that, and then I pass it on. And very interestingly, what I've seen for a lot of our customers is I've seen like RH9 data package, and then there's a little DataOps thing sitting right next to it. And that DataOps thing is the thing that they're using to put data up into their organization. And they weren't even aware that they may have been able to use their existing investments in the system platform or Intouch or others who have done the same thing. And so this is an area where we're looking at that more closely. The industrial Internet of Things, and this has been around for a while. I almost hesitate to even say it because I think that it's been one of those terms that's been leveraged so hard. I've seen everybody call anything from an industrial computer to a transmitter which has a lower WAN communication protocol. The key thing here is that we're starting to see a proliferation of new types of devices. Right? It used to be that everything got wired up, the remote I/O cards into the PLC, but now that's not true. Right now we're seeing a heck of a lot more devices which are not there in support of actual control, but they can use things like instrumentation which are in support of making better decisions. I'm going to make better decisions about product quality. I'm going to make better decisions about energy consumption. Power meters are a great example of this, which we're seeing a proliferation of power meters that aren't coming in. They don't wire them up through conduit that are terminated at PLC blocks. They're doing it in different manners and other ways. I'm not going to go through that level of detail with the market trends. I'm going to just state them. I think inflation and trade issues. Yeah, we've got seen a lot of that this year. But one of the things that's true is that often influences the cycles in which people invest. I think it's actually been a bit of a slower year than past in some ways. There's been a lot of people unsure what tariffs meant in terms of buying things and other areas there. Distributed workforce, a lot of cases the workforces have not come back from the pandemic. We're all working at home. Well, 5 years, even if you come into this office on a Monday or a Friday, that parking lot is a heck of a lot more empty than it is on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. We're starting to find that to be consistent around the globe, right? Where people are more distributed. Why is it interesting? Because less and less are people having access to the same compute resources they did when they were sitting in the same offices. We saw a huge acceleration of remote access capabilities when we went through that pandemic, and it hasn't really backed off. Geopolitical events, yeah, we got a bunch of them, and those are going to continue on there. We both, well, I don't know how much you know about this, but we used to have a large organization in Russia. We don't anymore, right? And there's a lot of things that can change the way you operate out there, and there's certainly others that are going to potentially actually on the horizon. Cybersecurity Resilience Act. Show of hands. Anybody here know about this? Already familiar with what the CRA is? That's Cybersecurity Resilience Act for short. In essence, what's happening is that there's becoming a regulation that's being pushed onto vendors, software vendors specifically, around cybersecurity regulations and compliance. There's a set of rules that we have to comply with when we sell into the European Union. We actually now have to seek a CE marking. Everyone like bought a piece of hardware, look at the bottom, it has like a UL label or it may have a CE label. CE is kind of like almost the equivalent of UL inside of Europe. We now actually have to seek a CE marking for our products. And if we are found that we're not in compliance with regulations, there are stiff fines. That'll require us to make some very significant changes. And I'll talk about some of that as I go through some of this. Increasing rate of change. Anybody notice that? I heard a statement the other day, something like, I can't remember, I think it took 4 years for cell phones to reach 100 million users, and I think it took like a month for ChatGPT to do it. Like it's amazing how fast change is being adopted out there, and how quickly there's an expectation of making material changes with those, along those. Sustainability. I don't think I could go to any one of our customers' websites, and if I tend to go into their websites and I look at their mission statements, their corporate mission statements, virtually every last one of them has this listed. Virtually everyone is somebody, we're going to be 0 by some number, right? 0 by 2035 or something along those lines. Every customer that I always deal with has some element of that. Data sovereignty. So who owns the data? Where's the data live? That's something that can be a very big issue. It was interesting, it was about a year ago I was first realized, and somebody said to me that, well, there's only 195 countries in the world. I was like, is that true? I did not realize it was that small a number. There are 195 countries in the world. Today, we can legally sell our cloud solutions into, I think, 60 of them, which represents probably like 90% of the GDP of the globe, if you will, that ones to be targeted there. But there are rules and regulations about where data is allowed to reside. So this is going to be significant. So it's not like I can just take every product and service and sell it to customers with impunity. There is a lot of laws and regulations. One of the things I will tell you, especially for our SI partners out there, one of the things one of my coworkers used to say is that I love regulations. They smell like money, right? Is that one of the things that's out there? There's a significant opportunity for us to help customers along those areas, and that's something that we intend to do. So I'm going to dig into some of these with a bit more detail. I think I tried to cover a lot of them already. How am I doing on time? I have about a half an hour for the following slides. I'm going to get to 3 o'clock and I haven't finished, we'll just call it. But we'll talk about this. So the Cybersecurity Resilience Act. You don't have to read all the text up on the screen. I didn't put there for you. Actually, the most important part just to be aware of is the point at the bottom, which is the URL. We already have a public-facing statement with regards to how Aviva is viewing and going to be reacting to the Cybersecurity Resilience Act. The one thing I'll tell you here is that for many of you may go, oh, EU, I can check out, that's not for me. I will tell you that it's going to change the way we operate globally. And it's going to be something we have to be very careful about. Because if Monterey sells a license, I have no idea that it's not going to end up in the EU. Right? You can sell a license to a customer that has a division that's sitting in Ireland somewhere. Ireland, are they part of the EU? Let's go with France. They're sitting in France somewhere, and then they actually deploy that license. And if I try to have a different set of policies for North America than I do there, then I have to make sure that every license that he sells and other distributors does not enter the EU. We're not going to be able to do that. That's going to be just far too hard. So we're basically going to be treating the whole world as subject to this regulation. So that's going to be requiring us to do things like, if we have an older version of our product that is not cybersecurity resilient CE marking, I'm not allowed to sell it as of December 2027. Now, I'm trying to figure out ways that we can help our customers, because I understand that my concern here is that many of you are not running even on our most current version, much less going to be able to adopt new versions with some rapid nature. So how do I make sure that you're running a 2023 R2 and our Cybersecurity Resilience Act version is 2026? How do you expand your installations? Those are things that I have to worry about to ensure that continuity inside of your businesses. There are other things that it affects us. So one of the things we have to do is we have over 3,000 vendors that we consume technologies from. It's not just in the HMI, that's all of them. We know this because we had to go and audit every last one of them as to whether or not they were going to seek a CE marking for the things that they do. So if I take a piece of code from somebody else embed it into my product, compile it in, and then they are not cybersecurity compliant, I can get nailed for it. And there are huge fines that can be associated with it. And the problem for me is that it's not even just Aviva's top line number they work on, it's our parent company, Schneider, which could be hit for percentage of our revenue, which would be very, very problematic. Right? So this is something that we have to take very serious, and I imagine we're not going to be the only ones that are going to be doing that. And you'll see this happening from other vendors. I think that we're a bit ahead of most, because I've asked some my other colleagues that work at other organizations, like, hey, where do you guys stand on CRA? And they're like, CRA what? Ooh, you guys gotta get on the stick. This is going to change things. I'll give you an example of something that is going to change. In-touch access anywhere is going to go away. Anybody here using in-touch access anywhere for remote access into either OMI, in-touch, or plants data, aka SciTech? I saw one hand go up in there. The reason being here is we licensed the technology from a third party, and I contacted them and I said, do you guys intend to seek a CRA compliance of this? They said no. I said, it's been great being your partner. I just can't. I have to stop doing some things. And so this is something that is going to change the way this industry operates. And so it's not immediate. For those of you who aren't aware, I put this on here to help you out. So CRA happens out here, December of 2027. We got about 2 years, a little over 2 years before this thing goes into effect. Now, we are already planning to achieve CRA compliance with our 2026 release, which we expect to go out about the May timeframe next year. Don't hold me to that date, but it's going to be around that timeline. We will see here that this thing that says STS versus LTS. That stands for standard term servicing versus long-term servicing. We recently changed our lifecycle policy, and with standard term servicing, it's the same as it's always been. That's always been what we call 3+2. 3 years where you have kind of full support, and then 2 years limited support, what we used to call extended. With long-term servicing, we're going to give you 5+2. And so we recognize that for most of our customers, this is, Microsoft does a similar thing, where they have their kind of, what do they call it, semi-annual channel versus their long-term service channel, where they have a small support policy for this one and a longer one. And most of our customers today only deploy on the LTS versions of Windows, right? They don't even take the interim versions. So I wanted to make sure that we had an LTS version in the marketplace, so I'm already planning the release of our R2 version that we have to plan forward for. It's probably a level of detail that you don't care about, but I shared it with you anyway, so we'll move on. So MCP, I put this slide up earlier, and I thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about it a little bit more, and just kind of pointing at it. So one of the things that we did here is I mentioned that with Historian. I feel that most of our customers use a very small percentage of the Historian's power in terms of being able to retrieve information from Historian. And so we're looking at how can we help customers to do that. So this is a bit on the nerd side. For those who like this part, then great. For those who don't, you don't have to pay that close attention. It's not critically important. But I will say that the notion here is that our Historian has an API. We have a REST API, or sometimes it's called the No Data Interface to our Historian, and that has a number of ways that you can pull data from that Historian. That API is what gets connected to by the Model Context Protocol, or MCP server, and it exposes that. So what happens is it's called tools inside of the system. And so what happens is that then it allows the large language models to exercise those tools, right? It's a part of that. So ultimately, you don't have to ever know how to call that API, because the LLM doesn't do that. And that's the focus on this here. And so the MCP server, in this example, what we did is we used a Claude desktop client. Claude, if you're not familiar with this, is an LLM that you can install either in the cloud or on-prem. We were installing this on-premise on a local machine. And we utilized the Claude LLM. Actually, we were using an Anthropic LLM, and we're using the Claude desktop client to be able to work between them and ask it questions. We chose to look at the Historian because I thought it gave me the broadest amount of value, because every one of my products pushes data to the Historian. So whether you're using InTouch, you're using Edge, you're using Plants data, you're using System Platform, virtually every one of our products can push data to the Historian. So we thought this was the greatest way for us to explore MCP, give you opportunity, and also not be in a spot where we can potentially affect process control, at least not initial one, because this doesn't issue control signals back. It's just how you get more value out of the data inside of the system. So that's at a high level kind of what's going on there. We're already kind of doing some proof of concept testing with that. We're excited about what we think that can yield. Here's another proof of concept that we're working on, which is around, I talked about generative AI and generative AI for graphics. And it's interesting because most generative AI that you will have seen out there, and it makes funny pictures of your coworkers. At least I see a lot of people doing that. Right? They make a picture of the coworker with maybe something silly written behind them or something along those lines. In this case here, what we're looking for is a bit different. Most of that technology around generative AI has been put together in a manner that's worked on images. They're often trained on the millions and millions of images that are out there on the internet today so that they can train on them. But what's not as good technically, it tends to be, is access to vector content, because we're not images. It's not raster-based, pixel-based images. We're vector content. And the capabilities for vector are not as strong out there. So we were testing some ways that, in this example, and I know you can't read this, it says the prompt we entered was build an SVG graphic. Each shape will be a unique object relevant to the SVG. This SVG will be a simple bar graph showing the current value, high and low limits for alarms to do the same style as the attached graphic. So we gave it a picture, and we asked it to create an SVG based upon that picture. And it was able to do it. And we were able to get that SVG imported into the industrial graphic editor, and bam, we were off and running. And so we believe that there are chances that we can help that. One of the things that we found is that you can actually use a prompt to write a prompt, right? So I can go to an LLM and say, write a prompt that will help me to build a graphic in this style. And so we can actually have the AI help you to write a prompt. This is an example of where it's called prompt engineering, and you can utilize that. This is something that we believe is a real possibility. And I think this one.
All right, so this is a Viva Edge, and you can see on the left, we have the chat. The chat, it is where the user is gonna ask for a screen to the application. You can see that I created a prompt called create a screen with a black rectangle on the middle of it. And right below, we have the status, which is the status of the call that I did to the application. And the screen was created. For the second prompt, I want something slightly different. I want to create 10 tanks with level indicators from 1 to 10. And you can notice that I have just written tank level 1, tank level 2, etc. I am expecting that the LLM will create the others by itself. And I paste my prompt, click on send, and the screen is created. You can see that we have tank level all the way from 1 to 10 with a bar graph. And for the third one, the third and most complex one, I want to create a monitor dashboard for 3 batteries. Each battery gonna have some status on it, each one with its own color, and some text, a current date and time on the top right, and some information about the level of the batteries. And then unpaste the prompt as well. And there we go. Here's the last screen.
Now, admittedly, these are very non-ambitious content pieces you see.
I'm going back to the edge, opening screen.
I'm going to move this forward. So it's early days, right? And it's still very early days in terms of what we're doing with generative AI. But we believe enough in it, and we expect that at some point it'll be table stakes. Right? We believe that this is now where we're going to figure out how do I teach these things styles, libraries of content that I can do things. We're looking at things like, can I just ingest a Python instrumentation diagram, point to a symbol library, and tell it to build based upon a current style? Right? There's areas that we're looking at this that we believe that we can cut the engineering of the quite expensive activities associated with creating process graphics significantly. And so we're hoping to be really early in the market with that type of technology. I mentioned earlier digital transformation. These are just some statistics that I had pulled off the internet where a lot of companies have basically reported that they've done something, right? So the first, it's 74% said digital transformation is the top priority for 74% of the organizations. I cited the source there. McKinsey company said 77% of companies have already started their digital transformation. 97% of the companies said that the COVID pandemic accelerated their activities. Right? They had to. They were forced to do that because of things that the pandemic had created. One of the things you keep asking yourself, so what in the heck is digital transformation? So I went out and saw a lot of input around what do you think digital transformation is? None of these are wrong, but they vary greatly. Right? I'll read a couple of them. So from IBM, it says digital transformation is a business strategy initiative that incorporates digital technology across all areas of an organization. Okay, we'll get that. McKinsey wrote digital transformation is the rewiring of an organization with the goal of creating value by continuously deploying deploying technology at scale. That's an interesting one, because I've seen a lot of customers that start saying that I have a digital strategy. And if a customer indicates they have a digital strategy, very often though, we have to be careful, because when I talk about that Kodak moment, and if I go out there and talk about HMI, SCAD, and SCADA to people that are interested in a digital strategy, they immediately go, you're not listening. You're not listening. You have to understand them much more clearly. The fourth one here comes from Industry 4.0 Solutions, says digital transformation is a strategy for making data the primary commodity in your business. It's a very drastic stance on that, but one that we're starting to see become more and more emerging as part of that. And so when we look at kind of how these things come together, you know, I've talked about Aviva Operations Control this morning, so I don't plan on spending too much time, but the steps by which people navigate that digital transformation: connect, collect, store, analyze, visualize, find patterns, predict, report, solve, as well as manage those things. And our data and our products that we're looking to bring together and converge into a cohesive solution to be able to facilitate that, as well as the commercial model associated with that. But we believe that it even goes further than that. This is actually some information. I pulled these off the websites of both of these companies so I can share it, because I was in Stuttgart, Germany earlier this year, and met with folks at Porsche. Porsche is also involved with Volkswagen and Audi. And they basically said they're moving all of their operations to microservice-based architectures in support of their digital strategy. They're spending billions. And they have set up, you know, their own R&D organization that's been focusing on this. And for those cases there, you know, anything that's currently lifted and shifted as a virtual machine may be a temporary solution that won't last long in their strategy, because it's not their long-term intention. Philip Morris International, I was in Lausanne, Switzerland earlier this year and met with them. And they have hundreds of licenses of InTouch. And most of them, they say they don't even turn on. They say they still have them there, they have them as a backup. But most of them, what they've done is they've created a little data gateway that's pushing things up into their MQTT broker that they're posting there, that is in support of their complete enterprise digital strategy towards operations. Things are changing. Things are starting to happen in the marketplace where it's not just talk. Where I would say a couple of years ago, yes, it was just talk. You know, people were talking about the potential, the opportunity. We're starting to see customers spend significant amounts of money towards this. And very often they describe some elements of a digital strategy. And so I plucked a few off and put them on the screen just to kind of share with you some of the things that we're hearing. Break down data silos across our business units, right? That's a focus of the digital strategy. One of the things that I've noted that's happened much more recently is I'm now starting to meet people who have a title. This is Chief Digital Officer. That guy didn't exist a few years ago, right? That guy, he wasn't even in the C-suite, right? There's a complete different role that we're finding. And their job is to help them navigate that digital transformation. Empowering teams with real-time insights and analytics. So the notion here is not only the guys who have access to the very top systems of the enterprise, but have everybody have access to the information that's necessary for them to make the decisions in support of their strategic objectives. Very important element there. Enable new digital services and business models. That's a key part of this, is that it's not just about run rate and continuing to do what they've always done. They want to change their business. They want to look at new revenue streams, new revenue opportunities. An example, if somebody makes a car, well, now other people have digital services allow them to make money when I want to tell the person to service the car, maintain the car. You start providing more information. That information is as important an avenue of a revenue stream to them as was the car itself. And it's changing business models of how they're doing that. And of course, they also have to do all of these things while they're ensuring compliance and security in a rapidly changing regulatory landscape. Again, these are just some examples. I'm not saying it's comprehensive, that you won't find customers that have other statements, but these are examples of things that are finding with a repeated nature. And very often when they go to here, we've asked them, how do you actually go about this? What do you do in support of that activity of that digital transformation? And here are some of the steps. First thing you do, inventory what we got. What do we have, right? How many things do we have? I mentioned an example earlier of 30 to 40 applications that are generating data. This could be everything from a transmitter to a custom database that someone wrote, to a piece of software that someone bought, to a service that they're buying from some vendor. They inventory everything. And then they set up rules for data quality, ownership, access, and compliance, ensuring that data is trustworthy and secure. How do I know that I can trust that data? How can I use that data? Make sure those rules. And then they start looking at the technologies that are going to be in support of their requirements. They define the requirements for a unified data platform, inclusive of scalability, integration, security analytics, and evaluating the best solutions in the marketplace. Then they go through and they connect their systems, start to cleanse and migrate the data and ensure everything works seamlessly together. They work on unified access and analytics, providing intuitive dashboard and analytics tools so that every team can make data-driven decisions. This is moving from just analytics to actually also being able to build services, right? So that agentic AI stuff that I was talking about is starting to evolve, not just in terms of UIs that allows you to go something's wrong, but I can build services that can react. Not react in the notion of where it's going to operate the client, at least not yet, but they may actually initiate a workflow that may require some, like they go ahead and set a work order in action to begin things to happen in those types of areas. Change management and training, so they have to make sure that the entire organization has achieved the digital fluency to wield this power. And continuous improvement, because they don't do this as one big shot. At least the ones who do it as one big shot usually choke on it, right? They usually, so what they typically don't do with the ones that succeed is they start with a couple of use cases, maybe just one. They start small, they prove it out, and they allow the results to dictate the direction of where they go. Right? This is a continuous kind of journey that it's repetitive inside of this space, and something that we want to help our customers work on. So I'm going to get the animations out of this one, but I'll start with here. This goes a little bit towards the software hosting journey, which goes a little bit beyond where we were just starting there. And the software hosting journey, I alluded to some of this earlier, that most of the case we start with installing things in bare metal. And we try to describe who has to have responsibility for certain aspects. Who buys the hardware in this example? Typically IT buys the hardware in this example, but not always, sometimes OT buys the hardware. In the case we're installing on bare metal, typically what we found is that the OT department are the ones that are installing the applications, right? That would be things like the people that install the system platform or other tools that you're putting on there. The environment is the operating system. Sorry, this is the hardware, this is the operating system. These are the applications, this is the example of system platform. And this is the application itself. So this is my specific application that I'm restoring, my Galaxy, if you will, I'm restoring or my InTouch application, something along those lines that I'm restoring. What you'll find here is that you start seeing shifting of responsibilities. When you're doing it on-premise and virtualized, what you'll find is that the environment now shifts to the IT department. Typically, they're the ones managing the virtual environments as a part of that. What you start seeing is that when the on-premise goes to the cloud virtualized, what happens is they start offloading that hardware to a vendor. Someone else's responsibility to pick up the hardware responsibility as part of that. We're starting to see more and more examples of Azure, Amazon Web Services. I've seen Google Clouds, a number of them that have gone out there inside of this space. We're starting to see an increased occurrence of on-premise containers. In this case, it's not really changed the responsibilities, with the exception of maybe the orchestration element moving over to IT. One of the things we found here is that it's not really it's not an easier methodology, it's a different one. It can be more complex. What we find here is that, I don't know how many of you can administrate a Kubernetes cluster. I can't, I don't never have to, right? But those are things that are different types of skills than the guys who might have been installing an industrial computer in a very different sense. Different skill set that's involved in those types of things. Moving up the cloud containers, in this case, you can see that we've moved the software from the OT layer to the IT. So instead of having a Windows box over here, you're now just going to be standing up the services and putting them in place. Ultimately, the end solution that we believe that will be the way most customers will want to go eventually once things become dependable enough is to be able to offload as much of that to the vendor as possible. Get myself out of this job. I don't want to get managing operating systems, managing software, and doing that. Will everybody make that shift immediately? No. But I think that they will start to do this over time. I think these are things that will start to move. And certainly, we have been leaning very heavily into this area, but when it comes to things in our industry, specifically for ancient rights data, where things are mission critical, safety sensitive, we have to be a bit more careful about how we do those things. Ultimately, I'm reminded of when I started working too many years ago, won't stick a timeline, but when Windows was kind of a new thing. No one trusted it. And so what we did is we continued so some of the first things I did outside of college was design the PLCs, the cabinet drawings, and also where the buttons, lights, and switches went on the doors, when we would shop it out to the panel shops. And typically we left enough buttons, lights, and switches so that if the Windows PC went down, I was fine. I could continue to stay in operation. What we believe is likely to happen is that as things shift more and more to the cloud, you'll put more resiliency in the things that are on premise. What we're starting to see today, it's a pretty commonplace, which has a lot of dead cabinets where the door's got no buttons, lights, or switches at all on it. It's just a big gray door. I think you'll probably start seeing that there'll be some element of, if that cloud thing's not available, I need to make sure that I'm going to be able to continue to operate on premise. It's just a model that we've seen work in the past, and I suspect it's going to happen in the future, to where your failover will be something locally, perhaps. So we expect that that's what we refer to as hybrid. So this is, again, kind of looking at some of that compute area. Not sure how much of this I want to go over because I've said a lot of this already. I mentioned earlier a Purdue reference model. This is what it looks like as an image, right? So where you have this stack, you're going to have point-to-point integration from sensors to PLCs to HMIs and SCADAs to MES and ERP. Customers are trying to navigate this larger software landscape by trying to integrate things together. What a headache. They can only do with this, and this is very hard to actually execute and even harder to keep alive. The UNS architectures where everything can communicate to one point rather than having everything communicate to everything. So this is kind of an emerging, if you will, architectural pattern that we're seeing more and more consistently as customers navigate these digital strategies and this digital transformation. I mentioned earlier that they can be tiered. You don't have to have only one unified namespace to serve the entire organization. So in this example, I can have a site-level unified namespace which could be running as a MQTT broker running locally on-prem. I can have another one, but then I could organize them such that they dovetail into each other to fill out my enterprise-level namespace. And these are all important, and this is an example of different ways you can model the data. This is just an example of how you can do that, and kind of how we see some of our products fitting into some of this. One of the things as part of this, I mentioned the word data operations earlier, and data ops. And one of the key things I like to say is that if I've got all these different things I need to integrate into, and I want to move them all into one consistent data model, do I push them all into something which transforms them? And what we found is because these systems tend to be isolated, which will end up as a lot of little tools that are kind of the gateways. And that's kind of what I refer to as data ops. The data ops are the things that can reach out to this and then say, I'm going to take it from its disparate model, so the one that didn't fit, and I need to fit it into this model I was describing before. So everything fits into one clean organizational structure. Does this organizational structure exist out here? If it does, you don't have much work to do. I'm willing to bet it doesn't, right? So the thing that helps you to get out of this non-properly structured format into the properly structured format is what I'm referring to as data ops. And this is an area where, certainly there's been an element of what we've done inside the system platform that's been already sort of done to this. But when we start looking at this in areas of system platform does great on some things that are more OT oriented, but customers are typically looking to see an MS system into a system platform. That's just not a practical usage of that technology. And that's an area where we're going to be investing to ensure that we can meet the needs of this. And this is a superly dense thing, and I don't expect you to be able to follow all of this, but I think this is like one of the last things. I'm going to start over here, which is, I mentioned something earlier that we have to be careful of declaring ourselves a Microsoft shop as we do development. And what does it mean? Where might it harm us? And so how am I directing my R&D organizations as we develop new code as we go forward? As we look for these core considerations, it must be platform agnostic. I must be focused on centralized orchestration and high availability based upon those infrastructures. Remember I said I have patents for redundancy? I wouldn't do that anymore, not the way we did it 10, 15 years ago. We would do it in a different way. We have to look at that more modern way of how those things apply themselves. Has to work with all IT policies. We have to get around this notion of, oh, well, I have to create exceptions for this endpoint protection software and things like that. It has to be microservice based. That gets us on that new operating infrastructure type of technology. Broad data type support across both IT and OT, built upon open standards. This is a key point here. Like in the future, I can see a world where I don't do SweetLink anymore. Because SweetLink is proprietary. SweetLink is just Aviva stuff speaking to Aviva stuff. How many third parties build for SweetLink? Not many. Some of our partners do, but it's not. I'm going to focus on things like MQTT and OpenCUA and other open standards that facilitate that. I'm going to be focusing more. I mentioned earlier that digital natives are becoming the majority. What do I mean by that? The digital natives becoming the majority is that when we first started building toolkits 20 years ago, plus, we expect only about 5% of our customers would ever use those toolkits. That's sort of inverted. That I imagine for many of you who are system integrators, when you're hiring somebody new, they're going to come in with some knowledge of some programming language, right? They're going to walk in the door having some knowledge of whether it's Python or C#, JavaScript or something. They're going to walk in the door. People are expecting to be able to exercise APIs as natural. So I expect that we won't have toolkits in the future, and just everything that we build upon open APIs. And that would just be the way we operate going forward. Things have to be edge-driven. I'd like to reduce the amount of entry input that happens and do more discovery. I like to describe us today as kind of being in the printer driver phase of our career. So for those of you who've been around long enough, when you used to buy a printer, it would come with a disk. You go to your computer, you install that disk, and then you go and you have to set up the printer, and you have to tell it the IP address of the printer that you just set up there. You have to configure it. Well, that's kind of the way we work with PLCs, right? I install the PLC, I put the driver over here, and I tell the system where that PLC is, what its IP address is, and what addresses I want out of the PLC. If you go buy a printer today, right? If you go down to Costco, Best Buy, wherever you let them buy your equipment, and you buy it, and you plug that printer into your network, it just magically appears, right? You open up your computer, there's my printer. Because it can discover it. That's what we refer to as edge-driven. I see a future where industrial will be more edge-driven. It'll be driven because these things will expose data models. Whether those data models are the ones like OPC UA or MPTT, or ones that are a bit more expressive, like if you look at the companion specifications port of OPC UA that's starting to gain some attachment and some ports to the industry. It says, if you're familiar with them, they're creating what they call their profiles, which is trying to accelerate smart manufacturing. And so I think that this edge-driven nature is going to only accelerate, and that's going to be a focus of where we're start. Ease of use, again, I mentioned a bit of that this morning, so I won't continue on too much about it here. Web everything, I mentioned that also earlier. Git integration. One of the things that we learned a kind of a bit of a lesson, is that we used to partner with a company called MPT for a product called Untitled for System Platform, right? And this was great because it allowed us to do version management for System Platform. Until MPT got acquired, and the people that bought that company decided to shut down the product. And we were, ooh, no. Right? And so the notion here is that I don't want to build tools that do version management. I want to plug into off-the-shelf tools that do version management, as opposed to building version management tools ourselves. So you'll see an example in 2026 where you're going to be able to export everything as text and dump it into a GitHub or dump it into a Git repository yourselves. So that's kind of a direction we're moving into this. Modern tech stack, this is important because a lot of the products that we build today, a lot of the tech stack we built them on are things that were evident 20 years ago, right? So if I were to start a new software organization, would I pick that 20-year-old tech stack? Nope, I wouldn't, right? And so we're going to be working forward and doing some great things there. Centralized status management, this is a part of it. One of the things I would say is that I think a lot of the philosophical approaches that we put into the system platform were absolutely nailed for that generation. I like to refer to it in some ways, I call it orchestration 1.0. Orchestration 1.0 allowed me to go to a Galaxy, connect it to an IDE, and then add a new piece of equipment to that and send it to somewhere out in that network. So I was centrally orchestrating that system, sort of. Couldn't really orchestrate the bootstrap, I had to go manually install that individually. So it wasn't 100% covered. And what we see in the future is that I'd like to go to what I call it orchestration 2.0, where I can go to a central place, maybe spin up a container, and have the container be synchronized down to a compute location, be that a Linux box, Kubernetes cluster, a private cloud, and those types of things that we're looking at. So pretty excited about where that could take us. How do we start? Industrial DataOps is where we're going to start. And what this allows me to do is start what I describe as a smaller picture of the things. Most of the things they're doing here are kind of things that you would do in HMIS data, but it has a very specific purpose. Connect the different data, normalize it, contextualize it, publish it to another target. It allows me to not have to worry about certain things. I don't have to worry about visualization, I don't have to do homework, I don't have to do a lot of the things that are typically data, so I can start to validate these things or eat the elephant, as I like to describe it, right, as we start to work on this. So I'm right at about time, so what I'm just going to do is hit the top level things where they orchestration, administration, standards management still becomes part of it, setting up an enterprise data model. Those are things that I believe I can do in the cloud and what we call Development Studio, and then run in a number of locations, whether it's going to be at the edge, inside of a private cloud, or even inside of our own software, our software as a service, i.e. Connect, that we were able to do that, to be able to connect those edge data services, create that local data model, provide the local calculations that can do everything from data transformation to cleansing and things like that, and be able to publish that to targets in a variety of formats. We've already seen that there's a need for this in the marketplace. We already know that there are people that are serving this need, And we're going to be looking at that first. And I'm expecting we'll see some of this in the next 6 to 12 months, right? So we're pretty excited about this direction that we're heading into. As I described for my internal teams, it's a whole new direction for us as a business. It's going to take a lot of the things that have separated us and start to unify us, because we came together as my team through a number of mergers and acquisitions. And I have everybody working on it. The guys from Plant Standard are on the same team as the guys from InTouch, the guys from Infusoft, the guy from Calvet. We have guys working together towards a common cause, because eventually I see this as being a common technology platform for all of our HMI state businesses. So we're very excited about the future. I think with that, I'm not going to go into too much of these things, and I'll just call this a day, because I'm at time on this. I hope that some of this was helpful for you to understand. And again, my focus here was less about the immediate future and just give you an understanding of where we see this market going. Does that mean that you won't be deploying a system platform this year? Or we still expect to sell a whole lot of system platforms, InTouches and stuff in the near term. But what I'm trying to help you understand is that we do see that this market is changing. And we believe that we have a part in helping to lead that change. So, thank you very much for your time and your attention.